So welcome everybody, and a special welcome to Denis Topal. It is my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Denis Topal from Chisinau, Republic Moldova. Since 2020, Denis works as a scientific researcher at the Archaeological Department of the National Museum of History of Republic Moldova. Synchronously, he's the head of documentation department at the National Agency for Archaeology in the Republic Moldova. Before that, and partly also synchronous with the just mentioned positions, Denis was engaged at the University of High Anthropological School, Chisinau, at the Department of History of European Civilizations. He worked there as a lecturer, and he is also, or was, the editor of the well-known journal Stratum Plus. At the High Anthropological School, he finished his first study, got a broad education in really various disciplines beyond cultural anthropology and archaeology. I would like to mention history of philosophy and medieval history. And there he also attended courses in English, German, Chinese. Everyone who knows Denis is impressed by his diverse language skills and also by his multifaceted knowledge. He describes his research with three key areas: warfare of early nomads, the positions of the Bronze Age, and barrow landscapes in the Western Pontic steppes. The first mentioned research issue was also the topic of the PhD thesis of Denis Topal, with the title Scythian Blade Weaponry of the 7th and 4th centuries BC. He finished his thesis in 2018 at the Institute of Cultural Heritage of the Academy of Sciences of Moldova. While his thesis was concentrated on the southwestern part of Eastern Europe, he has a really broad view on the blade weaponry of the early nomadic communities across Eurasia, reaching from North China to Central Europe. And in this context, I would like to emphasize his book published in 2021 on Scythian Akinakis. There, Denis systemizes data on Scythian blade weaponry from the territory of Central and Southeastern Europe. More than 200 swords and daggers he took into account. He brought the weapons of the early nomads in a broad cultural and historical background, covering all simultaneous cultures of the Eurasian steppe during the Scythian period. Thus, Denis was able to trace fundamental changes in the morphology of the Scythian Akinakis and to define so-called cultural types. And by doing so, Denis describes the dynamics of the weaponry in the early Iron Age. Denis Topal has an impressive competence in computational work and uses it to analyze patterns of moundscapes of the western fringe of Pontic steppe from prehistory to Middle Ages. Denis participated in many projects. I just want to mention one because it is connected with Berlin. So he participated in the project funded by this German Research Foundation, the Early Copper Age in the Northwestern Black Sea Area project. And he is a welcome guest in Berlin, not only in Berlin, I assume, but especially in Berlin, and has completed various research days at the German Archaeological Institute and also at our university. Denis has published more than 100 publications, and if you take a look at his works in academia or ResearchGate, the wide range of his field of research is really impressive. We could therefore have invited him to give a lecture on very different topics, but we decided that the early Iron Age in the Northwestern Black Sea region is a topic that should not be missed. So Denis accepts immediately, for which we are really pleased. And now the floor is yours. We are really looking forward to your lecture.
Oh, thank you very much for this introduction. I'm really touched. Dear colleagues and friends, thank you for having me here. I'm happy to be here even online. And first of all, I would like to thank Professor Dr. Elke Kaiser and Dr. Agathe Reingruber for this excellent opportunity to share my humble observation with such a great company today. So my lecture will be devoted to the early nomads of the Iron Age of Eurasia, with a particular focus on the Northwest Pontic region. And without a doubt, the most famous of the early nomads of Eurasian region are the Scythians. They firmly entered European culture, literature, philosophy, and the European cultural code, if I may, and became a kind of meme back in classical Greece. So, but actually, what do we know about the Scythians now, especially in the archaeological aspect? So, the Greeks, the first who encountered them in the 7th century and began to call these warlike nomads Scythians. First in Asia Minor, and then in the northern Black Sea region, where the earliest Greek settlements appeared in the second half of the 7th century BC. At the same time, the Greeks distinguished the Scythians from other northern peoples. The barbarians seemed sort of ignorant and wild to them, except the Scythians, who gave the ancient world at least one philosopher, Anacharsis, who, according to the Greeks, was included in the list of greatest philosophers. So, however, However, the Scythians is a common name for many nomadic tribes close to, in culture, economic structure, way of life, ideological things adopted already in ancient times. And also there are a lot of archaeological cultures connected to the Scythian period of Eurasia. So, for instance, Sentes-Vekerzu culture of Hungary and Slovakia, Chumbrut culture in Transylvania, steppe Pontic, forest steppe Dnieper, Middle Don, Ananino culture in Volga-Kama region, Gorohova culture in Trans-Ural, Spazorik in Altai, Bolsherechenska, Kamenska, and forest steppe Altai, Tagar culture in Hakasminusinka, and so on. Uyu culture of Tuva, Mao Zedong, Johann Miao, Yan Lan, Tao Hunbala in northern China, and so on. And this is an almost endless Scythian world, or it's the correct term would be Eurasian steppe cultural continuum of the Scythian period, which occupied about 8.5 million square kilometers and exists for at least 4 centuries. It stretched from Bratislava in the west to Beijing in the east, from Perm and Tumen in the north to Iranian Kurdistan and Gansu province of China in the south. So a short introduction, and let's start from the turn of the second and first millennium BC, from the moment of emergence of such phenomenon as nomadism. This is a specific phenomenon to which we owe the appearance of nomadic hordes in the next 2,500 years in Eurasia. And one of the main signs of nomadism is mobile cattle breeding. And by the second millennium, human beings were already cattle breeders with extensive experience in handling animals, but nothing changed human life as much as the domestication of horse. Naturally, a use of horse was found for it almost immediately. They began harnessing into to carts and then into war chariots. But at the turn of the first millennium BC, there was a real technological explosion, so-called cavalry revolution. So this is the most essential condition of nomadism. This revolution in warfare can be compared now to the drone revolution today, where affordable and efficient technology has a decisive advantage. Thanks to cavalry, the early nomads had such a stunning effect on the civilization of the ancient East. In general, the advent of even-wheeled transport almost immediately expanded the inhabited world, and cultural exchange accelerated. When people began to ride horses, cultural processes picked up, unbelievable speed. A chain reaction starts in the steppe. This steppe belt is a real highway of antiquity, and these armed elites are being formed, and this formation of these armed elites is the third and the most important sign of nomadism. And nomadism is quickly spreading across a broad belt of steppes and foothills of Eurasia, stretching for thousands of kilometers, tightly pulling a vast flat space from Central Asia in the east to Central Europe in the west. Indeed, nomadism since 10th century BC becomes a highly successful survival strategy. And here is a little about the region I'm directly involved with, the northwestern Black Sea region. So being the most western periphery of the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the northwest coast of the Black Sea is surrounded by Carpathian Mountains to the west, the Danube to the south, and Black Sea also to the south. And this position led to the fact that the cultural landscape since early prehistory was influenced by three main factors. So Central European one, or forest steppe or even forest regions from Central Europe, Southeast European or Balkans, and probably the most important one, East European steppe, especially during Iron Age. In any case, the Balkan factor also played a crucial role. It brought Greek colonization in the region, relations with the Thracian world, and a clash with the Achaemenid Empire, which penetrated Scythia from the southwest part. The Central European factor felt weaker, but perhaps it turned out to be decisive at the end of the Scythian era when the Celts penetrated the region from the northwest. Over the next few centuries, Central European influences became mainstream, but this was covered much better in the talk by Michael Mayer and Octavian Munteanu in their lecture on pre-Roman times, which you can also find on this channel. A feature of the region is closely related to the eastern factor, the presence of many mounds, many burial mounds or barrows or tumuli. And according to my calculation, there are at least 11,000 of them between the Dniester, Prut, and Danube rivers. And only a small part has been studied, a little more than 10%, but these data allow us to confidently reconstruct the region's long-term, almost continuous kurgan or barrow tradition. Actually, there are two main periods of barrow construction. The first one is connected with pre-Yamna and Yamna communities of the late Neolithic, early Bronze Age, and the other one is linked with the Iron Age, with the early nomads traditionally identified as Scythians from classical written sources. They are colored blue on the charts. And let's go back to the very beginning of the Iron Age and to the most important thing, what happened then against the backdrop of the emergence of cheap weapons, horse riding, and livestock breeding. The so-called steppe generator of people started working, and this event is most often associated with climate change and increase of humidity with a decrease in temperature. With the beginning of the first millennium BC and over the next 2,000 years, the steppe will almost continuously throw out nomadic streams in the western direction. It is impossible to determine exactly where this herd was or generated was located. Eastern Kazakhstan or Zhetisu or Seven Rivers, Altai, Tuvas, Sinzan, and northwestern Mongolia can equally successfully claim these territories. At the end of the 10th century BC, the first wave of early nomads arrived in the Black Sea region, and having reached the Black Sea region and Ciscaucasia, it takes shape in the form of cultural horizon that corresponds to the historical Cimmerians of the 10th, 7th centuries BC. Some of them are at the end of the 8th, early 7th century BC, entering in Transcaucasia and participating in military conflicts of the states of ancient East, according to written sources. If we use archaeological terminology, this is so-called Prescythian period. Of course, Prescythian burials of 10th, 7th centuries BC, we know relatively little, much less than Scythian ones, and a few dozen versus several hundred. But in any case, there are much more of the pre-Scythian burial assemblages than proper Scythian. But then early Scythian burials of 7th, early 6th centuries BC. On the map to left, pre-Scythian burials are indicated in black, and early Scythian burials are indicated in red. Not only is the quantitative disproportion clearly visible, but so are the spatial differences. Pre-Scythian or Cimmerian burials are concentrated mainly in the lower Dniester, and early Scythian burials are located to the west, north, and south to this area. Pre-Scythian burials, as a rule, did not contain rich grave goods and were included in early constructed mounds. Two groups are traditionally distinguished, flexed on the sides. Chernigorovka, you could see here two graves, and extended burials, Novocherkassk, which are considered a little bit later. Here you could see three of them to the left. In the grave goods, the main object is pottery. So the pottery is decorated with some geometric patterns, and most often the analogies to this pottery can be easily found among the forest steppe cultures of Hallstattian period. Another specific element of the culture of the early nomads of pre-Scythian period is weapons and horse harness. On the top right is you could see the recent find from the northern Moldova, from Sokola. This item is the function is connecting parts of horse harness, or in other words, it was designed for wagon or war chariot. There is no exact analogy, but artifacts similar to in design are found in Central Europe, Black Sea region, and North Caucasus, and the main chronology of them fits in the late 8th century BC. Weapons are represented mainly by swords and strafines, just like in the early Scythian period. The earliest blades are bronze, Karasuk type. Later, bimetallic or purely iron ones appears, so-called Kabardino-Petigorsk type, to the bottom of this slide. The dagger above is a relatively recent find from Moldova, and now it's the most Western one to date. Cultural processes picked up this cosmic speed, and when people began to ride horses. So I have already said that with the emergence of nomadism, cultural process and cultural exchange have developed at an incredible speed. So the distribution of Karasuk daggers can serve as an excellent illustration to this take. They united Europe and Asia for the first time and spread from Siberia, Mongolia, and China to Moldova and Ukraine. Later, Kabardino-Petigorsk sword, you could see with the black dots, most likely arose under the influence of Karasuk one, but were limited only to the territory of Europe. And now, actually, about the Scythians. So the beginning of the second wave of early nomads is associated with the late 8th century BC and already correlates with the early Scythians. At this time, they crossed the Volga River and go into forest steppe Dnieper region. Other horde turns to south to the North Caucasus at the end of 7th early 6th century BC. They are involved in military operation in Asia Minor and Middle East, and even reaching the borders of Egypt. At the same time, the Scythians established a foothold in Transylvania and Hungary, from where they launched some raids into Central Europe. Herodotus, actually, the main author of classical work, gives three versions of the origin of Scythians, so mythological, legendary, and historical. At the same time, the historical version by Herodotus seemed to him the most plausible one, and in principle corresponds to the modern ideas that the Scythians came to Europe from Asia along the Great Steppe corridor. In general, a similar version of the early history of Scythians is presented by Diodorus in 2nd century BC, following which the Scythians first lived near Arax River or modern Amudarya River, and then moved to the foothills of the Caucasus and the northern Black Sea region. And with the arrival to the Caucasus, the famous campaigns in Western Asia began in the 7th century BC, in which the Scythians played a very noticeable military political role, becoming for a time either allies or opponents of many great ancient Eastern states of that time: Assyria, Urartu, Media, Babylon, Egypt, Lydia, and with it, evidence of these campaigns were numerous precious trophies buried in the graves of Scythian leaders. For example, the so-called Melgunov Kurgan or Melgunov barrow in Ukraine, and Kellermes burial mound in Caucasus, in northern Caucasus. The third wave dates back to the second half of the 6th century BC, as associated with the new arrivals from the east. Then a lot of things of Central Asian appearance come to the Black Sea region, and Dnieper settlements and Greek colonies were burned. At the end of the 6th century BC, also another event occurred that became one of the most famous in Scythian history, reflected in written sources. Scythia was again involved in the sphere of big world politics around 512 BC. The king of the Persian Empire, Darius the Great, took a considerable army to the left, the Scythian bank of the Danube River. And without going into a detailed retelling, let me remind you that the main idea of the Scythian nomads was to lure the enemy into the territory and deprive them of provisions and fodder to wear them down, and with constant horse attacks. So the same tactics actually was also applied when Napoleon entered the Russian Empire. So, and it was applied by the Russian general who discussed this Scythian plan or Scythian tactics, Scythian war, with the great antiquarian, great historian of classical antiquities, Bartold Niebuhr. And the victory over the Persians affected the northern Black Sea region political situation and became a turning point in Scythian history. So the strengthened Scythians were supported or even replaced by a new horde of nomads who apparently also came from the east at the end of the 6th century, began to put pressure on Greek colonies, some of which could fall under the Scythians' protectorate. Some groups of Scythians came into Central Europe and reached the northern Balkans. It was at this time that a dynasty of kings appeared in Scythia, ruling for almost a century. And the end of the 5th century, the golden autumn of Scythia begins. This is the time of the greatest number of royal and aristocratic mounts. The Scythians settled on the steppe, and their culture took on its classical forms. In our in my region, this forest steppe vacuum is filled by the Geta or the Thracians, who once lived here. And second half of the 4th century BC is the time of the highest prosperity of Scythia, and soon this idyllic picture will come to an end at the end of the 4th, early 3rd centuries BC. Probably some new characters in this play will appear, and several miniature enclaves will remain from the Scythia in Dobruja in Romania, in the Dniester left bank, and Crimea. But let's look at the distribution structure expressed in burial features, with the most popular element of Scythian panoply, I mean the arrowheads. So the bronze casted arrowhead is one of the business cards of the early nomads of Scythians, which started in the pre-Scythian period. On the one hand, the seriality of the production of arrowheads smoothed out some individual preferences of warriors. On the other hand, it accelerated the evolution of this type of weaponry. And there are mainly sort of 3/4 of items dated to the classical period, and which corresponds to the general chronological disproportion of Scythian antiquities in northwestern Black Sea region. In the area of my interest, the assemblages with arrowheads form relatively stable and recognizable patterns. For the early Scythian period, the main concentration is associated with the burial mounds in Bukovina. In the Middle Scythian period, the flat burials with arrowheads are related to central Bessarabia and so-called Birlat Plateau in central part of the eastern Romania. Scythian burials in the south are still rare, since even the Bujak steppe, so the southern part between Dniester and Prut rivers, is saturated with Scythian burials in classical times, starting from the last quarter of the 5th century BC. Here you could see some early Scythian assemblages with arrowheads from Stresheni, central Moldova, and Kukunești, it's northwest part of Moldova. Here you could see the early middle Scythian arrowheads with internal sleeves from Denceni flat burial ground at the phase 1 of the second half of the 6th century BC. These are the arrowheads of the different Middle Scythian silhouettes from Denceni, it's phase 2, or the late Middle Scythian period of the first half of the 5th century BC. And that difference of shape of arrowheads is also expressed in planography of the burial ground. In general, there are a noticeable change in the planographic pattern from these early to the late stage. Also, the early Scythian arrowheads differ in shape and size and weight from the Middle Scythian ones, and the composition of the alloy also differs. Early Scythian arrowheads, like both pre-Scythian ones, fit into the Caucasian pattern according to its chemical composition. And the Middle Scythian arrowheads production demonstrates the change from this Caucasian pattern to the Western alloys in the middle of the 6th century BC. The spread of nomadism at the turn of the 2nd to the 1st millennium BC led to an absolute explosion in the development of weaponry. That is why weapons are among the most sensitive social or ideological change indicators, because people are very creative in making weapons. The sword or dagger of the Scythian period, or akinakis, and its design became a business card of early nomads, alongside horse harness, funerary architecture, and jewelry. The particular attitude towards weapons reached its highest point in the Scythian period, when the akinakis became an object of worship and even the embodiment of the god of war. And all this suggests that the turbulent cultural processes of this steppe continuum had an impact on the appearance of bladed weapons, which were closely linked not only to the everyday life of nomadic warriors, but also to the religious or funerary spheres of their culture. The distribution of Scythian swords generally follows the pattern seen on arrowheads. Early Scythian barrels with swords were found in the north, and straight lines were in the center, exactly where the barrels with Middle Scythian swords would later appear. The assemblages of the classical period are traditionally associated with the lower Dniester and Danube rivers, you could see on the map on the right of the part of this slide. And here you can see the early or archaic Scythian akinaka, or the Kellermes type, from the central Moldova from the second half of the 7th century BC. And here you could see the distribution of this type, which particularly does not extend beyond the European range. These are daggers from the beginning of the Middle Scythian period, such as Shumeiko and Vettersfelde types from the second half of the 6th century BC and start of the 5th century BC. In the east, the distribution is limited to the Ural Mountains, but they come far to the west. For instance, Akinakis from Vettersfelde, which is kept now in the Altes Museum Berlin, is still remains the most western find of Scythian swords and daggers in Eurasia. And this is the most common type in Scythian times, so-called the Kosia type from the end of the Middle Scythian period of the first half of the 5th century BC. Its distribution is still limited to Europe, but that's it's just an exception, because during the second half of the 6th century BC, other Akinake appeared on the territory of European Scythia. They have really original ornithomorphic antenna pommels and are not associated with the early Scythian concentration of Akinake with simple antenna pommels. The appearance of the ornithomorphic and zoomorphic pommels fits into the framework of the common Eurasian tradition. And this is a completely new tradition of so-called griffin daggers or daggers of Sikh type, and they became extremely popular in Volga-Ural region, Seven Rivers or Zhetisu in Central Asia, Sayan Altai in Siberia, and Ordos in northern China. Here you could see the distribution, which can only be compared with Karasuk distribution. These are already stylized forms, and this stylization of pommels in the form of birds follows the same scenario in both Europe and Asia, but the types, materials, and designs of European and Asian items are very, very different. On the right, you could see the final version of this stylization, which makes it difficult to discern of the image of the bird. It's completely unrecognizable, you could see. Here, again, the paths of the evolutionary lines of Europe and Asia diverge, but this is the last time in Scythian period that then you could find the absolutely identical sword designs in both Bulgaria and Siberia. Soon, in Europe, the Scythians will abandon their traditional sword and replace it with Greek and traditional items or the imitations. One way or another, at the end of its biography, the Scythian sword first loses its original animal style, then its double-edged blade, and later its recognizable phallic hilt. Or in other words, no matter how weird it may sound, but the latest Scythian Akinake can hardly be called Akinake. In the late Scythian culture of the 3rd, 2nd centuries BC, the Black Sea region's population ultimately refused to use swords, giving preference to spears, javelins, axes, and this may be accompanied by a complete loss or partial one of the cultural identity, given that the sword was not only and not so much a weapon. Instead, it was the most crucial element of military culture, religion, ideology, or at least one of the most essential elements of funerary rite. One way or another, this storm of swords, if we use the metaphor by George Martin, the Scythian period was replaced by this storm of sword of Scythian period was replaced by unexpected calm, but as usually happens in the steppes of Eurasia, not for a long time until the other armed horsemen come from the east. Another element of the military subculture in the Scythian stone statues and the bronze cauldrons connected with the barrows of the mounted horse riders. The statues are directly associated with the mounds on which or near which they're usually found. This allows us to narrow significantly the chronological position of almost all known sculptures. As a result, the statues follow the whole Scythian culture, but chronologically they are distributed somewhat unevenly. Scythian statues depict the warriors with various attributes of military culture, including the sword, which is represented on a third of statues. Chronologically, the distribution of images of swords or akinaki in Scythian sculpture is close to be a normal one or a Gauss distribution, with a peak in the third quarter of the 6th century BC and a gradual decline by the end of the 4th century BC. However, the gradual disappearance of the akinaki from repertoire of stellar coincides with the rapid growth in the number of statues in the first half of the 4th century BC. And another important element of the military culture is the bronze cast cauldron. Scythian cauldrons are rare in the northern Black Sea region, especially on its western borders. According to the latest data, at least 117 finds of bronze cauldrons of the 7th, 3rd centuries BC are known on the territory covering the Pontic steppe, the Kuban region, the Dnieper forest steppe, and lower and middle Don. Scythian bronze cauldrons in the west are concentrated in 3 main regions: Bukovina, Podolia, which unites northeast Romania and western Ukraine, lower Dniester and lower Danube. Pretty far to the west of them is located a stray find of bronze cauldron found on Hungarian-Slovak border near the town of Szörny or Komárom. Another thing directly connected to the mounted horse riders' military culture is the horse harness, of course. Here you could have a look at some assemblages with the horse harness of the 5th, 4th centuries BC. To the right, you could see the earliest, to the left, sorry, you could see the earliest one from Birzholteni burial of the late 6th century BC. In the center, you could see Nikolskoye, it's late 5th century BC, with the elements in the Scythian animal style. And to the right, you could see the latest, to the right top, you could see the latest examples of horse harness. It's the 4th century BC, and it's typical Thracian silver plaques in traditional Thracian animal style. Part of horse harness are, horse harness are also ornamented boar tucks and their imitations, like found in Birzholteni, mentioned before, and they are widespread within the nomadic world of Iranian region. And in addition to the Black Sea region, are found in the Caucasus, the Volga region, the Urals, South Siberia, and Altai. Most of these items fit into the late 6th, first half of 5th century BC framework, and there is no doubt about the general vector of this distribution. So of these boar tusks and the imitation from east to west, and they come to the northern Black Sea region, probably from the territory of the lower Volga. This is the last manifestation of the eastern vector, or if we in the Scythian culture, along with the griffin daggers of Issyk type. From the late 5th century BC, the golden age of Scythian culture started, and by the middle of the next century, it had turned into a real golden autumn with its inevitable end. So most aristocratic or royal mounts of Pontic Scythia belong to this period, and then an original group of horse harnesses elements of Scythian Thracian origin appears in the 2nd and 3rd quarters of the 4th century BC. So what conclusions can be drawn from this kaleidoscope of patterns, vectors, factors, and artifacts? Judging by the material culture, early nomads become recognizable on the move, on their move, interacting with other cultural worlds, or without new impulses, the nomadic culture dies or freezes. And towards the end of the classical period, Scythian culture lost the Scythian type sword, which is closely associated with the religious and ideological sphere. The sword was the embodiment of the god of war. But this is the only god to whom human sacrifices are made, and whose real name Herodotus doesn't know. He calls him Ares in Greek. The Scythian animal style also disappears, and the stone sculpture with images of warriors, the Scythian horse harness, and the bronze cauldrons. In a word, everything that made up the recognizable appearance of the Scythian archaeological culture disappears. Late Scythian culture is so different from classical Scythian that you can't help but wonder what Scythian remains in it. Yeah, another thought comes. On the one hand, we are witnessing the disappearance of the main elements of Scythian military culture: weapons, harnesses, statues, cauldrons, animal stein, and so on. And on the another, a natural fireworks display of grandiose royal mounts and golden madness. And maybe the disappearance of these main symbols was the death of culture, or symbolic death of culture, so uniquely expressed in the objects and artifacts. Thank you very much. It was an absolute pleasure.